Mr. President, I rise to talk about the pending amendment. Mr. President, let's all imagine a situation. You're a 25-year-old, a father of two, it's night, and you're walking home across a park. A group of teenagers come near, and they throw a slur at you. When you respond and their verbal attacks escalate, they're nasty. They seek to dehumanize you because of where you were born, how you look, or how you speak. There's a fight, 4-on-1, in which you're pummeled to the ground and kicked in the skull repeatedly. As you lie on the pavement in convulsions, foam oozing from your mouth, life slipping away, there is one more insult. They yell a warning to anyone who looks like you or talks like you that they'll do the same thing. Now imagine you are this man's two little children. Your father spends 2 days in intensive care, his face bruised and swollen, his head bandaged, tubes everywhere, and then he passes on from this world. You'll never remember your father holding you, or feeding you, or kissing you. You're too young. What you will remember is growing up without a father. He was the victim of a needless death from a senseless beating, a beating fueled by red-hot hatred for the type of person he was. The one hope from some small measure of fairness, so that these two young children will one day know that justice was served after their daddy was killed, would be an appropriate conviction for this unthinkable crime. But in the courthouse, the verdict is read. The most serious charges, the most appropriate charges, are discarded. At most, 2 of the 4 young men who committed this murder in a bigoted rage will spend less than 2 years behind bars. But they could be there for as little as 6 months. 6 months in jail. But this man, this father, he's gone forever. It is as sad and as heart-wrenching a situation as you can imagine. And how we wish it was only that, a horror story that we simply imagined. But it's not a figment of our imagination. It's a dose of reality. This nightmare scene actually happened, and it didn't happen in a society less open than ours, nor did it happen 100 or 200 years ago. It happened exactly 1 year ago in Shenandoah, Pennsylvania, less than 150 miles from where this chamber is, less than 50 miles from my home state of New Jersey. Luis Ramirez was the target of the vitriol and the beating, struck in the chest so hard that he bore a bruise in the shape of Jesus Christ from the medallion he wore on a chain around his neck. As he lay seizing from the deadly blows, if he had still been conscious, what he would have heard were words that, uncensored, do not befit the United States Senate. Tell your explicative Mexican friends to get the explicative out of Shenandoah, or you'll be explicative laying next to him. Tell your explicative Mexican friends to get the explicative out of Shenandoah, or you'll explicative be laying next to him. In the 21st century, here in the United States of America, the land of the free, all men created equal, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Not for Luis Ramirez. He may have been born originally in a different country, but he was just as human as you or I. It didn't matter. He was cursed and battered and put down like an abused animal would be in the United States of America. And the people who did this, the people who beat their fellow man to death, treating him as subhuman, this gang gets a veritable slap on the wrist. We can change that. No more circumstances like that, not with this legislation. There is no better prosecutor of hate crimes in our country than federal law enforcement. They are tough on these hate criminals, and they are determined to serve justice in each and every one of these cases. If we are to make sure that hate crimes are treated with the seriousness that they deserve, if we are to make sure that would-be perpetrators think twice, federal law enforcement must have a greater involvement. Now, I can hear opponents of this legislation, this particular amendment. This is 2009. Our president is African American. It's a reaction to an insignificant problem. Well, ask Luis Ramirez, if you could. I would ask them to consider this from the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. Between 2003 and 2007, hate crimes reported against Hispanics increased not just a little bit, but by 40%. In 2007, Hispanics were the target of 60% of hate crimes committed based on ethnicity, signifying an increasingly sharp rise. But this isn't just a problem confined to the Hispanic community. The man who packed up his rifle, got in his car, drove to Washington, entered a building, opened fire, and claimed the life of a noble security guard, he didn't just do that at any building. He did it at the Holocaust Museum, because this murderer hates Jewish people, hates them enough to kill. And let's never forget the namesake of this legislation, Matthew Shepard, the University of Wyoming student who had his whole life ahead of him before it was snatched away on an October night in the countryside near Laramie. Two men, uneasy with Matthew's sexual orientation, drove off from a bar with him, only to beat him mercilessly with a pistol and rope him to a fence, as if a warning to the gay community. They hated Matthew because he was gay. He lost his life because he was gay. I ask those who would argue against this legislation, how many more tragic stories do we have to hear before we make our laws tougher? How many more? Do we have to hear another story like the one of Jose Osvaldo Susquehanny? Last December, this father of two, a native of Ecuador who ran a real estate agency, was a member of the community, upstanding member, was headed home with his brother from a bar after a church party. These brothers walked down the Brooklyn street with arms around each other like men in Latino cultures often do. Up drove three men, yelling slurs that were both homophobic and racist. They belted Jose on the head with a glass bottle. They smashed his head in with a metal bat. They continued to beat him and kick him and beat him and kick him. Clung to life for 2 days in a hospital, and then he died. How many more stories? Do we have to hear another story like that of Marcelo Lucero? He too was born in Ecuador, and he too was a real estate professional. And he too was killed simply for the way he looked and the way he spoke. The innocent victim of a senseless gang of teenagers on Long Island, driving around in search of, quote, some Mexicans to explicative up. Here's how the prosecutor described this assault. Quote, like a lynch mob, the defendant and his friends got out of a car and surrounded Mr. Lucero. Like a lynch mob in the 21st century in the United States, the mob beat Marcelo and stabbed him to death. Mr. President, how many more of these stories? How many more? Do we have to hear another story like that of Walter Sanchez? His horrific story happened earlier this year, and it happened in my home state of New Jersey. Walking to a restaurant with his cousin, a car with 5 men pulled up. calling Walter a Hispanic son of a explicative. They beat him senseless. But he was one of the lucky ones, escaping with his life. But he still underwent hours of reconstructive surgery to put many of the bones in his face back together again. So again, Mr. President, how many stories do we have to tell? It's time to stop asking, and it's time to start acting. We can pass this legislation and know while there is still a ways to go until we have wiped our society clean of bigotry and hatred, we will have made it harder for the perpetrators of these evil acts to escape justice. As the law is written now, there are too many ways in which those who commit hate crimes can escape the kind of justice federal law enforcement is prepared to bring. Sometimes these loopholes are bewildering, even perverse. Remember the story of Luis Ramirez, whose murderers will serve as little as 6 months in jail? The cruel irony is that the deadly beating he suffered occurred in the street, not in the park 100 feet away, the park where Luis had walked minutes, if not seconds, before he was battered. If this murder of a hate crime had taken place in that park, it would have been federal law enforcement's business. The delivery of justice may have been different. As it turned out, local law enforcement, some of whom were related to the assailants, took 2 weeks to arrest the 4 men. And we know how the rest of the process turned out. We can all agree a hate crime is a hate crime, whether it's in the park or in the street, on the grass or on the pavement, 100 feet this way or 100 feet that way, a hate crime is a hate crime. Now, I sponsored, when I was back in the New Jersey legislature, the law that became one of the first landmark legislation on hate crimes in our country. I said then that we cannot eliminate hate with the passage of a law, but we can send a clear societal message that we do not tolerate such crimes against individuals because of their race, because of their religion, because of their ethnicity, or for that fact, their sexual orientation. Hate crimes are hate crimes. They are all an affront to the set of values upon which this great nation stands, and they all deserve the full scrutiny of our federal law enforcement. It's time to pass this legislation, and I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of the amendment and make sure each hate crime is met appropriately with justice. I ask you to remember, as I started this speech, about that father kicked to death with the 2 children who will never, ever know their father, as so many of us are fortunate to know ours. When you cast your vote, think about that, but for the grace of God, could be you. That's how momentous a decision this is. That's how important this legislation is. And that's why justice is served with the passage of this amendment. That, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
And adjourn the absence of a quorum.